My wife, Trisha, and I, we will celebrate our 27th anniversary here this month. And when we were in college, we both had a heart for adoption and foster care. At the time, we were both social work majors. And but we knew, we dated through college, we knew that we wanted to wait until we were married. Or we wanted to wait to get married until we graduated. So we graduated, and 6 days later, we got married. And we went into inner city ministry and moved into an inner city community in Denver, Colorado. And our goal was to move in there to serve churches, to work with children and their families while we lived in that community. And one of the things that we learned pretty quickly as we were living in the community we were living in is that over half the kids we were working with on a weekly basis had been touched by foster care at some point in their lives. Some of them were in foster care while we were working with them. Some of them had been in foster care in the past and had been reunified with their biological families. A lot of people get a heart for foster care because of interaction with the kids. And that certainly was part of the truth for us. But part of the reason we got a heart for foster care was because we had interaction with the families, with the bio families, with families that were struggling, with families that even at the time we would consider friends and neighbors, but who also weren't treating their kids very well in some cases. But we learned to love them, and that was part of our story. So eventually, we had been married a few years and had been doing ministry a few years, and we decided to become foster parents at 25 and 26 years old. Any of you that have done foster care before know that there's a little bit of paperwork involved in that process. And one of the pieces of paper that we had to fill out at the time, this was a while ago, but a piece of paper we had to fill out had a whole list of things, either conditions, medical conditions, or experiences that children might have or might have experienced. And we had to check off, yes, we would consider bringing a child into our home that has experienced this or who has this. No, we wouldn't consider this, or maybe. And so it would be things like, would you consider bringing in a child who has a hearing impairment? Yes, no, might consider. Would you be willing to have a child come into your home who's experienced sexual abuse? Yes, no, might consider. I don't know all the things that we checked on that form, but there's a few things I'm pretty sure about that we did check no on. One of them was sibling groups. We were 25 and 26 years old. We didn't know what we were doing. We were first-time parents. Let's start with one at a time. That seems reasonable, okay? Second thing I'm pretty sure we checked no on was major medical needs. I mean, it wouldn't have even crossed our minds to check yes on that. I mean, surely there are nurses and doctors and physical therapists and those kinds of people who are foster parents, and that's where the medical kids go. But for us, let me remind you, we don't know what we're doing. Let's just have kids that are a little more straightforward than that. So we get a call from the social worker, and she said, well, we've got these preemie twins. For those of you that struggle with math, that's more than one. We've got these preemie twins, and they've been in the hospital for 3 months, and they were 10 weeks premature. They were born under 2 pounds. One of them had an open heart surgery at 11 days old and almost died. They will be on oxygen for up to 18 months. They might have cerebral palsy, but we won't know that until they're 2 years old. What do you think? Well, I don't think you did a very good job reading the paperwork. But she did something that is not normal in foster care, but because of their high medical needs, she said, you don't have to make a decision without going down to the hospital and seeing what would be involved in their care. So you can actually meet them and understand more what's going on with their care before you say yes. And so my wife, being who my wife is, who is the picture of the compassion of Jesus, we get off the phone and she's like, well, we can just go meet them. You know how this story ends. And so we go down to the University Hospital in downtown Denver, and we go to the neonatal intensive care unit. I grew up in a town of 1,200 people. That's 1200, 1,200 people in the middle of Kansas. And so walking into the neonatal intensive care unit at a major university hospital in Denver, Colorado was intimidating. And there were incubator after incubator with baby after baby and all these cords and tubes and beeping, lots of beeping in this place. And we walked through the entire unit, and I just couldn't believe how many tiny babies there were in this place. We walked to the very end of the unit, and at the very end, there were these two doors that opened up, and in that little room, there was a little room, and there was a giant steel crib. See, these girls had been in for so long, they were gigantic by NICU standards, but they couldn't breathe. So they were still on heavy oxygen, but they were gigantic. So they got their own room. They were 5 pounds at this point, gigantic. And so we walked into this room. We looked over the edge of this crib, and there were tubes and cords running everywhere. The machines were beeping and taunting me. And the thought goes through my head, I don't have what it takes to do this. Now, I don't know about you, and I don't know, maybe the men especially can relate to this. I know as a boy growing up in Kansas, we spend a lot of time just wondering, do I have what it takes? Do I have what it takes to jump over this creek and not get wet? Do I have what it takes to jump out of this tree and not break my legs? Like, you're always asking those questions when you live on a farm in Kansas. Do I have what it takes? And as I'm looking over the edge of this crib, I'm pretty sure I do not have what it takes. But as we prayed about it over the next day, as we learned from the doctors and nurses what would be required, as I talked to my wife, the Lord impressed something on my heart that He'd impressed on me before that time when He first called me to inner city ministry out of living in the middle of Kansas, never having lived in the inner city before. And He impressed the same thing on my heart again that day. Is it doesn't matter if you feel equipped to do something. If I've called you to do it, I'll equip you to do it. If I've called you to do it, I'll equip you to do it. So we said yes. This is not a surprise, right? We already knew that. We know where this was going. And so we went and we picked up these babies. Let's see, can we get to that slide? Yeah. And this is the day they came home from the hospital. Now, this stroller is part of the story. It's part of what I want to talk about today. Because the stroller was a double stroller, brand new from Babies R Us. I don't even know if they have Babies R Us anymore, but Babies R Us, the place with an entire wall of pacifiers. Who needs an entire wall of pacifiers to choose from? Babies R Us. But there was a stroller there. We didn't have a double stroller. We made the decision, and when we told them yes, they were like, well, you need to come get them. We're like, well, no. We need like a day to figure out how to do this stuff. But we needed this stroller, and we didn't have time to get it. And so 2 women that we worked with went by Babies R Us and picked up the stroller and the car seats so we could get these guys home. And these 2 women stepped in, and they helped make this happen. Like I said before, God said, if I've called you to do something, I'll equip you to do it. So those 2 ladies were a very small first step towards Him equipping us to do something that He called us to do. And then the other reality that we were facing at the time is we had moved into a small house that had previously been a drug house in downtown Denver, and we were renovating it at the time. We weren't planning on bringing infants home quite this soon. We'd done the training and everything, but we weren't quite ready. We had no kitchen floors. And so it was plywood. And so David from our church and a friend that I to this day still don't know showed up at our house while we were at the hospital getting trained on how to raise these babies and finished putting in the wood floors in our kitchen. And then we brought them home. And we had, it was really funny actually. There was nobody that was qualified to watch these kids. They said, well, you can't have anybody watch these kids who's not medically trained because of their needs. I was like, but you gave them to us. Like, what? But we had some friends at church who were doctors, June and Steve, and they made sure that we had date nights. John and Diane, John was a doctor and she was a social worker. They gave us date nights. And we had Miss Carla at our church who came once a week. And she just said, I'm gonna just come and play with the girls, and Trisha, you can do anything you want. And she came once a week. And it was through those folks, we had meals for weeks and weeks and weeks. We couldn't leave the house. We knew quarantine before quarantine was cool. We had to stay in the house because they were susceptible to respiratory virus, and we were in there, but our community had come around us. And so very early on, we learned that you don't do this alone. The ability to do what God calls you to do is directly tied to the community doing it together. The way that God equips us to do hard things is he equips us with his body. He equips us with the community to do it together. This is the girls a few months later. After they were, they were they were doing well. They look a little frightened right there of the camera. They were on oxygen, one of them for 18 months, one of them for 9 months. They didn't end up having cerebral palsy. They've had a few struggles here and there, but they've done really well. This is them in their senior pictures. They're now 22. Now, today we're going to I'm going to give you a few examples of when God calls someone to do something, or when somebody's expected to do something, how the community makes that happen together. What does that look like? And I'm going to give you a few examples. I'm going to start with a really, really, really old example. Then I'm going to give you a pretty old example. And then I'm going to give you some very, very recent examples of what that looks like. So let's start with the really, really old example. In the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah says, "Then the king said to me, 'What are you requesting?' So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, 'If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it.'" Nehemiah had gotten word that the walls of Jerusalem had still been broken down. They had been destroyed decades earlier. And he got word that they were still not repaired. And so Nehemiah finds out the news, and he weeps over this fact, and then he says, "Well, I'm going to go fix it." How many people had walked by the walls of Jerusalem every day, and nobody said, "Hey, let's fix it"? Nehemiah hears about it once, and he says, "We can do something about that. Let's go fix it." And so there's a few principles that we're going to talk about throughout this whole time, and Nehemiah and all these stories exemplify these things perfectly. But the first step is believe it's possible. Nehemiah saw a problem, and he believed it was possible to fix it. In foster care, we have resigned ourselves to thinking that it's terrible, and it's always going to be terrible, and it has to be terrible because it's a terrible thing. But I don't think that's true. I think the people of God have been put in the places they are, in the communities they're in, to do something that he will equip us to do something very, very hard. I do not want to make light of the fact, to do something very hard. But he will equip us to do it. So first of all, we have to believe it's possible. We have to look at our community and say, hey, this is possible. So let's go secondly. Later on in the book of Nehemiah, this is one of my favorite passages in all of Scripture. It's a listing. So the funny thing is about lists in the Bible, right? So we know about some of the lists in the Bible. You think about Leviticus, and you just go, oh my gosh. I mean, how many more times can we talk about how to cut a goat's neck, and how do we, what in the world? And then you look in the book of Matthew, and who begat who, and and so, if we're honest, how many of you have gotten to this passage and you kind of skim, you just kind of tune them out, right? Well, this is an example. It's just, all these lists of people. But you know what? If you dig into the lists sometimes, you find some pretty cool stuff. I remember one time I was looking in Matthew, and this is just on the side. I was looking at Matthew, I was like, hey, wait, Jesus had a grandpa. And it lists, I was like, did you ever think about that? Jesus has a grandpa, and his name is in the Bible. I'm not going to tell you who it is. You got to go look yourself. But so this list, if you look into the list, sometimes you find gold, and in this case, you find goldsmiths. Next to them, Uzziel, the son of Hananiah, or Harahiah, goldsmiths repaired. Next to him, Hananiah, one of the perfumers, repaired, and they restored Jerusalem as far as the broad wall. Next to them, Raphiah, the son of Hur, ruler of half the district of Jerusalem, repaired. So you've got a ruler, next to a goldsmith, next to a perfumer, working together to repair broken things. Now I have a question. It's going to require some of you to get up. Would you please stand if you are helping in the foster care space in any way at all? Whether that's professionally, whether that's as a foster parent, whether you're supporting somebody, if you're helping in the foster care space at all, please stand. All right. Now, if your career, your job is actually to do that kind of work, then I want you to sit down. But if your professional training does not have anything to do with foster care, then stay standing. All right. So you all that are still standing, I love you guys. You guys are the perfumers. Like, who thought, we got to build a wall, let's go find the perfumer? Right? You can sit down. But you guys are the perfumers, and it's important that everybody does their part. And we've heard it today, right? Everyone can do something. Everybody has a part to play, and it's important to do your part. And let me tell you this, never underestimate the power of the perfumer to make broken things whole again. And one of the things we've gotten away from in foster care in our country is we have sat back and we have left it in the hands of people that are paid to care. When it's our community, it's our kids. Our churches have a responsibility to care. Our churches are full of perfumers who are pretty good at rebuilding walls. You just have to give them an on-ramp, hand them some tools, and watch them go. Then Nehemiah 4:7, they faced opposition. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. That was my very angry voice. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. Does it ring a bell? Anybody's journey? Right? But then there's this. So, in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans, with their swords, their spears, and their bows, and I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. The phrase that stands out to me here is by their clans. They did it together. They banded together. So they believed it's possible, they did their part, and they did it together. And that's what it looks like in your community as well. Do it together. In 1981, there was a farmer and his wife, Herman Ostry, and his wife, Donna, and they moved to Bruno, Nebraska. Population 143. Right there in the middle of Nebraska. And they bought a farm, and the farm was awesome. It was a great place for animals and to raise a family. It had one issue. It had this barn on it that was always flooding. Every time it rained, there'd be standing water in the barn. And so if you know anything about farming, that a barn full of water doesn't do you much good unless you're a duck farm. So it was really useless. You couldn't store food in there. You couldn't have animals in there. And so they tried to figure out solutions to this problem, and they began to brainstorm possible solutions, and they were all really expensive. Like, they just couldn't afford to do any of that stuff. And one night at the dinner table, Herman Ostry, he joked with his family. He said, you know, if we just had enough people, we could pick this thing up and move it. And everybody laughed and went back to eating their mashed potatoes. The next day, his adult son, Mike, who was about 24, 25 at the time, he went out with the tape measure, and he began measuring the boards in the barn and counting them. And he figured out what each board weighed, and so then he figured out that the barn probably weighed about 16,000 pounds. And then he figured if we were going to move it, we would probably need to put a steel grid in place throughout the whole thing to keep it stable in order to pick it up, and that steel grid would add 3,000 pounds. And if the average person could lift maybe 55 pounds or so, then we would need 344 people to pick the barn up and move it. Hypothetically, theoretically. And so he talked to his dad, and they decided to go to the Centennial Committee, because the Centennial Committee was planning the 100-year anniversary of the town of Brno, population 143, and the town down the road had just celebrated their centennial, and they had created, it was a Czechoslovakian community, they had created the world's largest fruit kolache in the Guinness Book of World Records. Not to be outdone, Farmer Herman and his son, Mike, they proposed to the Centennial Committee, well, let's move a barn for our centennial. And so the Centennial Committee thought this was a good idea. And so they, on July 30th, 1988, they invited 344 people, and remember, this population is 143 of the town. They invited 344 people to come move it. And so 344 people did come, and 4,000 people from 11 states came to watch. And so this is that day. All of these people from all over the place coming to watch what could either be one of the most beautiful things they've ever seen in their lives or the greatest catastrophe in the history of Nebraska. And so all these people are here, and Farmer Herman, he gets out front, he's got the microphone, and he's giving instructions to these 344 people who are around the barn, inside the barn, in the steel grid. That barn is full of people. All of them are grabbing the steel grid, and on three, they lifted it off the ground. And the crowd goes wild. And they carried it 110 feet up 6 feet, up a 6 feet incline and turned it 90 degrees. Now, the people in the barn ranged in age from 11 to 90 something. They turned it 90 degrees and they set it back down where it was dry. Now, y'all, our foster care system is flooded. And the words most commonly associated with foster care right now, when you look at, I have a Google search set on my computer, getting articles every day about foster care from all over the country. And you could sum up most of the articles with the words not enough. So-and-so county needs more foster families. So-and-so county needs more adoptive families. So-and-so county, like over and over and over again, our foster care system is flooded. And when something is flooded, the normal and natural reaction to flooding is to grab a bucket. And so we grab a bucket and we begin to scoop, and when we realize that we're not making the progress that we think we should make, we decide, well, let's get another bucket. If we just had another bucket, if we just had another staff person, if we just had a little more money, if we could just get this grant, we just need another bucket, and then we could solve this problem. And so we keep adding buckets, and we keep adding buckets, and we keep trying to scoop out the water. The problem is the rain keeps coming down. The water keeps flooding in. Kids are entering in care every day. And at some point, somebody has to stop and say, this isn't working. The way we've been doing this, it is activity, and it helps to some degree, but it's only gonna make the barn less wet, it's never gonna make it dry. And so if we're gonna do something, we're gonna have to think differently, we're gonna have to move the barn. We're gonna have to move the barn. And so we're going to talk here for a minute about 4 principles of moving barns and providing more than enough for children and families in foster care in your community right here in West Virginia. There's 4 principles we can learn from Farmer Herman and his 344 friends. Number 1, if you're going to move a barn, know where you're going. Know where you're going. If they had decided, hey, we got to move this barn 10 feet to the left, and they picked it up and they moved it 10 feet to the left, what would have happened? It would have flooded, because you got to know where dry ground would be. They had to go up a certain amount of incline in order to get it dry. So you got to know where you're going. Well, what does that mean for us in foster care? Well, for so long in communities in foster care, we have allowed our focus to dissolve from solving the problem to just trying to do a little better. Like, well, maybe we can do better this quarter than we did last quarter. Maybe we can do better next year than we did last year. And I guess that's okay for one thing, except for one thing. While we're doing a little better, children and families are falling through the cracks, and children are suffering. We can't afford to do a little better when there's so much left undone. And so so instead of our aim being, hey, let's help more next quarter than last quarter, we need a different we need a different vision of where we're going. And so what we would propose is a vision for every community is the vision of more than enough, that is dry ground, that we should be aiming for more than enough, because here's the deal. We serve a God of more than enough. When the nation of Israel was wandering through the desert and they were hungry and he provided manna, he didn't provide not enough, he didn't provide just enough, he provided more than enough. When Jesus fed folks lunch on the side of a hill and they had basketfuls of leftovers at the end, he didn't provide not enough, he didn't provide just enough, he provided more than enough. For some reason, we serve a God that feels, he has this compulsion to provide more than we need. And I don't know what that is, but I believe that he does that, and he wants us to reflect that as well. And I believe that is possible for the children and families in our community. I believe that actually the resources and the people actually exist to provide more than enough in every community in the country. It's just a matter of getting them going in the same direction, working together towards that end. So when we say more than enough, what do we mean? We mean 4 things. More than enough fostering kinship families for every child to have an ideal placement. More than enough adoptive families for every child waiting for adoption. More than enough biological families with the help needed to stabilize and reunify. I don't think I have to say this to this room based on the conversations that I've had today, but foster care is it's not about taking kids out of bad families and putting them in the good ones. Foster care is about caring for entire families and being committed to bringing families together or keeping families together whenever we can. That's part of our job as the church too. And then more than enough wraparound support from the church for foster, kinship, adoptive, and biological families. That's dry ground, my friends. If we can focus together on those things in our community, we can move the barn. Number 2, if you're gonna move a barn, you gotta get some extra folks. Bruno, Nebraska, population 143. They needed 344 to get this thing done. They had to go outside of city limits to get it done. You're gonna have to go outside your denomination to get it done. You're gonna have to go outside the comfort level you have with working, between church and state to get it done. Like, those lines have to be crossed. You're gonna need some extra folks. The folks are there, but the artificial boundaries we've set in place for them aren't gonna work if we're gonna get to more than enough. So we're gonna need some extra folks. Number 3, if you're gonna move a barn, put the steel grid in place first. And that means a couple of things. So when it comes to working together in a community, at some level, this conversation we're having right now is, hey, let's all work together. But there's a lot of hard work that has to happen to actually collaborate with others in your community, because we're gonna be asking you to collaborate with people you don't like very much, you have history with, you have conflict with. You think that the work they do is, it's okay. But you're gonna have to work with them. And so there's structures there's a lot of hard work that has to be done and structures that have to be put in place. One of those structures is prayer. That what we're talking about here is not a big campaign, it's not a recruitment effort, it's a movement. We're asking God to move in your community to provide more than enough for children and families, and no movement in history has ever happened apart from prayer. So that's the first part of the steel grid that has to be in place. And then there are just other structures. You need to be building trust with people. You can't expect to collaborate with people that you don't know and you don't have a relationship with. You can't expect to do a brunch every so often. Like, you guys need to be hanging out. You need to go do stuff together. You need to find ways to like each other in order to work together. Those structures have to be in place. So you got to put the steel grid in place first. And then number 4, if you're gonna move a barn, listen to the guy with the microphone. Farmer Herman was out front and he was giving instructions about how to get this done. And they had to listen to what he was saying, they had to do what he said, and they had to do it in unison. They had to lift at the same time. If they had all lifted at different times, if they weren't listening, if they were talking to each other, they had to listen to the guy with the microphone. Well, we have a guy with a microphone. God has spoken to us loudly in his word about how we work together, how we should work together. There are all kinds of examples, and I'm going to give you just a few, of places in Scripture where our guy with the microphone, the Lord of the universe, has given us instructions about how to get the barn moved. Here's a few examples. Philippians 2, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. John 17:21, I pray that they will all be one, just as you and I are one, as you are in me, Father, and I am in you. And may they be in us so that the world will believe you sent me. And by the way, when Jesus prayed this the night before he died, it says right before this that he was praying for his disciples and that that would come after them. So what that means is all of you, because all of you know Jesus, because ultimately the disciples told somebody, who told somebody, who told somebody, who told somebody, who told you. And so he was praying for you. And so if I were to ask you, hey, if you knew that Jesus prayed for you the night before he died, would you want to know what he said? He didn't pray that you would be a regular church attender. Sorry, pastors. He didn't pray that you would have a quiet time every day. All these things are very important, by the way. I want to make sure to say that. But what he prayed is that we would be one, that would be unified. The one thing Jesus prayed the night before he died for us is that we would be one. 1 Peter 4:8, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. And so these are a few examples of where the guy with the microphone has given us clear instructions about how to work together. And we have to do it. And we have to do it in these ways. So I told you I'd give you a really, really old example. That was Nehemiah. I told you I'd give you a pretty old example. It's 1988, which doesn't feel old to me, but to some of you that feels ancient. And then some recent examples. I'll give you a couple of recent examples. In the state of Arkansas, there's one organization who has rallied together all the service providers in several counties across the state. And their goal is largely to work with moms who are incarcerated, who are trying to reunify with their families, but they really come around and provide services to families that are trying to stay together or get back together. And since 2019, they have pulled together 65 collaborating organizations. And they've used a technology platform. It's called Restore Hope. And in Sebastian County, Arkansas, this is just one example, and they're in several counties. But they pulled together 65 collaborating organizations. And often what happens, and this comes as no surprise to any of you, what happens in foster care, it would be like, if you were going to build a house and you brought all the best subcontractors in town together and said, hey guys, we're going to build a house. We've got the blueprints. All right, we're going to start tomorrow. Well, if the roofer shows up tomorrow with a crew and a bunch of shingles, you've got a problem, right? Because it's not time for the roof yet. Well, that happens to families all the time. The services exist, but they don't get them in the right place at the right time, in the right order. And so what they do with this technology platform is they get all of the service organizations on the same platform. Families only have to fill out the TANF paperwork one time, not a bunch of times. Lynn is looking shocked, right? And so it saves those families time. And they have gone from 42% reunification rate of children in foster care with their families to 85% of children reunified. And they're tracking things like employment and stability and housing and all those things. So children are being safely kept at over twice the rate they were before. That's the power of a community working together to restore broken things. Give you another example. In College Station, Texas, there is a group of churches and organizations working together. They're called BCS Together, Bryan College Station, Texas. This is where Texas A&M is. And so one of the volunteers, one of the women that was involved with this organization, as she got involved with her clothing closet and some other things, she began to learn more and more and more about foster care. And one of the things she learned was that a lot of kids, especially teenagers, were sleeping in the child welfare office at night because there's no place for them to go. And guys, she couldn't sleep. Like she could not handle that this was a reality in her community. And that's kind of the reaction we all should be having, right? When we encounter these things, we want it to keep us up at night. That's It's not okay. And so she began to pray and think, and one of the things her and her husband realized is that they had a rental property, and so they donated the rental property, and it was pretty close to the child welfare offices, to be used as an emergency shelter, just for a few nights until they could find proper placement for these teens. Well, the problem is it was an empty rental property, and so they had an interior designer from the community that said, hey, I'm going to put together design boards for every room in this house. And they put those design boards up on Facebook, and they asked the community, hey, would you be willing to adopt one of the rooms? Here's the design board. Here's the stuff that's needed. We're doing all new stuff. We're not doing anybody's used stuff. Our kids deserve the best. We're going to give them the best. And so all of these different preschool, they adopted like the reading area, and they donated all the books. And the wives of the Texas A&M football team coaches, it's a mouthful, but they donated a room. And these other folks donated another room. And they had a lawyer that they talked to about securing liability insurance for this place, which is no small task. And they went through all of the process to get liability insurance. And when they called and said, hey, we found something, we've got it, and we were talking to the other partners of the law firm, we actually want to cover the costs from here on out for the liability insurance. The community came together, and to everybody's surprise, this thing got up and running in 3 months. That kind of stuff doesn't happen. I think we could ask Lynn, how long would you expect an emergency shelter run by, this is not a knock against our child welfare system, but if it were up to the child welfare system alone to put an emergency shelter and get it up and running, how long would that take? At least a year, longer than 3 months. But the church and the community coming together can make broken things whole again. And now there's volunteers from the community coming in. I talked to one of them just the other week in an interview. She comes in every Thursday night and brings pizza and hangs out with the kids that happen to be there that week. And she's building relationship and connection. And so those kids have that opportunity where they were before staying in a child welfare office with a social worker. They're now building connections to the community. And the connection that they have with her, they now have the opportunity to have all of her connections because she's connected to a whole lot of people. And so that happened because a community came together. And this is the place. It's just one picture of the place that they refurbished and did. So what about here? What's it going to look like right here in this community in West Virginia? What does it look like to believe it's possible? We're not talking about just increased foster care activity, doing some of the same things. Don't get me wrong, foster care activity is good. It is responsible for so many good things happening to so many kids. It is responsible for the kids that I have in my house. We have 5 adopted from foster care, and foster care activity is responsible for those kids getting into our home and being there. Foster care activity is not bad, it's just not sufficient. And so what would it take for us to believe it's possible to work together to provide more than enough, to do our part, and to do it together? On my flight out yesterday, I was sitting on the plane from Charlotte to here. I'm from Dallas, connection in Charlotte. And on the flight here, I sat next to a woman who grew up in Hurricane. And she actually doesn't live here anymore. But she was coming back to visit her grandbaby. And just before we landed, I said, hey, can you tell me something? I said, what is Hurricane's greatest strength? Didn't take her long. And she said, the people. They stick together. They stick together. So I've got no doubts that this is a community and this is a state that can do this together. And they can do it for our kids. Our kids deserve it. Our kids deserve better than activity. They deserve foster care movement. They deserve us to move the barn for them so that they can be safe, they can be protected, they can be unconditionally loved, as Dr. John said. Thanks.